Hi, I'm Emily Spurr and I'm an author. My book, Beatrix and Fred, which is out via text publishing, is about Beatrix and Fred, Beatrix being a slightly misanthropic loner who has hate-hate relationship with most of the people in her life, and Fred, who is a twin-set wearing octogenarian stalker. And the story follows their push-pull of becoming friends, I suppose. Beatrix and Fred is quite a bit different to A Million Things. It is possibly my weirder novel, whereas it does have some similarities as well. There's another age difference in the two main protagonists. And there, again, are themes of loneliness and mental health and connection and isolation and community and finding joy in unexpected places. But other than those massive similarities, it is as like A Million Things as chalk and cheese. It is what I would call probably a very bonkers love story. It deals with themes of what it is to be human. It deals with the brain-body connection. It deals with questions of morality and plays with a lot of things in that vein. So I suppose there are a lot larger ideas in Beatrix and Fred, and in many ways it's possibly a much more complex novel than A Million Things. I think we have a massive fascination with the unlikely friendship, don't we? I mean, the age has the two of us, and the best ones of those are always when it's two people that you're just blown away, get along really well. So there's probably a little bit of that going on. But I think mostly, I think there's something that's also not that unlikely about it. And when I examine myself, possibly it's we have, in A Million Things we had a young girl and an older woman, and in Beatrix and Fred we have, a middle-aged perimenopausal woman and a much older woman. And all four of those life experiences tend to be characters and people who are overlooked. And they tend to be either expected to be invisible or to be quiet, or they're caricatured, or they're seen as, not the meat, they're just the sandwich. I disagree. I think these are fascinating people in absolutely fascinating stages of their lives, and I want to play with them, so I do. And so there is that similarity with both, with very large age differences. But I think most of us would probably have that in our lives anyway. And some of the relationships in my life that I value the most are with people with very different life experiences to me and at different stages in their life. And I guess that fascination sort of carries into who I write about as well. This novel is not a pandemic novel, but it was written in the pandemic, and it was written with me in a very dark, cramped, cold room with a view of my neighbour's fence. Delightfully, at about 11 o'clock, the sun would hit the neighbour's fence and I would get some reflected sunlight, which, I looked forward to every day. And the house was very full. We have a small house and my kids are at home and we're homeschooling, and for a large period of the 2020, my partner was out of work, and it was a fairly stressful time. I'd signed on for to write a new book. I was also the only one working, and on top of that, I also was dealing with perimenopause, and doctors telling me that it couldn't be perimenopause because I was too young, and it was a really fun time in my life. And I suppose a lot of that bled into the characters, and also it became an escape. So Beatrix is quite misanthropic and grumpy. She doesn't see other people's feelings as her responsibility, and as such has no qualms in pissing off everyone around her. And that has gotten worse in her recent history. And I think there was a certain amount of release in writing that at the time. So there was that. And then also I'm sitting in this dark, cramped room feeling quite stressed. And I'm looking out the window at a wall and I'm thinking, what the hell are we? You know, what are humans? We have created through our, unrelenting expansion into everything, these zoonotic diseases that are now exposed our vulnerabilities, our very animal vulnerabilities. And we've all retreated into our houses and, where we've created this problem and now we don't quite know what to do about it. And the way that we live is making it even worse. And yet, who are we that we think we have the right to take everything over in this way? What is a human? Is it because we're conscious? Well, what's that? And certainly those ideas are quite prominent in the novel. I'm trying to not give too much away. And all of that fed into it. So the idea of what happens, particularly with things like perimenopause and hormones, which obviously are chemicals. And we think of things like that as very much being like a reproductive issue, but hormones and chemicals affect your brain and it's a neurological issue. And what happens when the thing that you think you can rely on might not be that reliable? What happens if your ability to know what's real and what isn't real is no longer something that you feel you can trust? So that all fed in there as well. And I suppose also the perimenopause was quite fun to play with and deal with because it wasn't much fun to go through it. But there was a lot of learning and a lot of research that went into it. And when women of a certain age, and we're expected to fade quietly into the background, and when we become sad, bad, or mad, and we don't do that, that becomes a problem. And that's very much Beatrix. Some of it was research and some of it, so yeah, I've had an MRI, and there was a certain amount of escapism in writing that too. When I was writing that scene about the MRI, in my head I was somewhere else. I was back when I'd had mine, and I'm remembering the sounds and the feels and the uncertainty and what was said to me, and the floor under my feet and the vulnerability of being in a gown and not knowing, do I tie it at the front or which bits do I want to hang out? So all of that, writing this book took me out of that little dark room, which was needed. So there was a lot of research, and then I spent a lot of time, listening to MRI sounds over the internet. I spent a ridiculous amount of time looking at CT scans and MRI scans on screens and the fMRI scans and watching how they move and how you scroll through them, and learning the different parts of the brain and being able to, and what they did and why they were important, or we might be worried about something in one and not the other. So a huge amount of research went into that. And because there's such a focus involved in that, I actually found that quite wonderful to write, which is strange. I didn't actually download a bot myself and use it, but I did do a lot of research into it, and I read a lot of articles and first-hand accounts of people that had used them. The idea from bot probably came from a podcast I think I listened to in, it must have been 2019. And I think it was a morality researcher actually got quite fascinated with this idea of chatbots and can they moralise? So decided to teach a chatbot because they learn through interaction, how to philosophise and how to answer moral questions, just to see if it could. And she spent months and months and months having these conversations with it, and eventually it did. It started sort of speaking the language and seeming to be able to have a moralistic conversation. And that obviously burrowed its way in there and came out as bot. So the nitty-gritty research was I went and I researched all the different companies, what they offered, what that involved, how they interacted with the customers, and the sorts of things that they could and couldn't do. I'm also a very paranoid person, and I didn't want to give them my information, so I did not download one myself. But yeah, I did do a lot of research into that, and that went on for months. And I was really gratified when, just before the book came out, the whole chat GTP thing blew up, and I spent a lot of time poring over, what people were saying about that, and felt quite pleased with myself that I seemed to have got it right. Beatrix was always a difficult character in terms of her prickliness. In my mind, she was always quite an aggressive and angry person, but for me, that was always coming because she was so sad and she couldn't look at it. So I suppose I didn't get a huge amount of surprise from writing her. That said, though, so when I started the book, it was all written from that very tight third-person perspective, and it was all Beatrix, and I didn't have the Fred parts in there. It's sort of when I've done the first pass and got to the end, which is no longer the end, that I realised that we needed to hear from Fred. And I was a bit worried too that there was quite a massive genre switch happening, and I needed to introduce to the story much earlier the idea that there was something unusual going on here. So Fred's voice came in as well, and I was quite convinced at that point that I was all over Beatrix. I knew who she was, I knew what that was all about, and then I discovered through Fred and Fred's voice something very delicate about Beatrix that perhaps hadn't been there beforehand, because Fred saw something in her, something very obvious once you've read the book, obviously different about her, but also very subtle things that were quite different. And she saw, something beautiful in her. And seeing Fred explain that, or, writing Fred unravelling that, exposed that to me as well. And I began to see Beatrix differently. So certainly my view of her did evolve. I start a book, I have no idea how it's going to end. And then usually about a quarter of the way in, I'm like, got the ending. And that ending won't necessarily stay the same. And that's how this one started as well. I mean, I've had a version of this idea, like the seed of this idea has probably been kicking around in my head for 15 years. And it took all of those things coming together at that time while I was writing a book for me to go, this is what I'm going to do. But I didn't know what it was. I had kind of knew what it was, but it unfolded for me as I wrote it. So it did change a bit, and the original ending that I had is not the ending that I have now, because as I wrote the characters, it just wasn't right anymore. And I mean, writing this book, to be honest, at times was utter torture. I cried over it more than once. It was, amongst all that other stress, it was horrendous because I was so determined to bring people with me on this weird and wonderful tale. I wanted it to feel, it's something that's possible, might not be likely, but it's certainly possible. And I wanted that possible and that sense of a reality that feels real. I wanted that all the way through the novel. And there was a lot of self-doubt. Can I even do this? Like, this is a crazy idea. Can I do this? Can I bring people with me? Can I make this feel perfectly real and not jerk people out of the story? And that was utterly torturous. I think I got there in the end. But in the end, what I learnt, and I think every book's a bit different, but I had to listen to the characters. So when I'm trying to take it in one direction or trying to make it one thing, it just wouldn't work. And then I just, write something for fun and the characters would take off, and it felt like they were showing me the way, which sounds a bit crazy. Uh, but they taught me in a very roundabout, strange and slightly torturous manner what it was. And I just had to let it be what it was, which is this, darkly humorous, quirky, odd love story. Emily Spurr, when she's not writing, I'm an editor and a content developer, so I freelance and do that. I often work on university textbooks, so perhaps that's where this obsession with random ideas that somehow fit together comes from. I love to garden. I'm a very enthusiastic, not always successful gardener. I run. I think a lot of my ideas come when I'm running, probably because no one can talk to me. So I'm just in my bubble, and I've that's me. And I've got my kids and my partner, and I'm obsessed with bees. I don't want to keep them. That seems like a lot of work, and I have a lot of things to do. But I love them. So I've just got every single plant that can flower all planted all around my house, and hanging from baskets, and and I just love watching bees. I've read a few things recently that I loved. I really loved Yellowface with R.H. Kuang, which was squirmingly delicious. And just, you just need, something that you tear through, and it was just what I needed at just the right time. And I really enjoyed it. I have sitting on my bedside table Bee Sting by Paul Murray. I love Paul Murray. But that's my reward at a future time. And I'm currently, look, I even have it over here. I'm currently reading this, which I was sent and didn't know anything about. So that's The Will of the Many by James Islington. And I knew nothing about it, and I wasn't, it's quite heavy. And I sort of thought, well, I'm not allowed to read Paul Murray yet because I have some things I have to do first. So I'll give this a go. And I've been getting into it. I don't mind it. It's sort of fantasy, slightly sort of historical, but obviously in an alternate reality. And the characterizations are good, and it's pulling me along, and I'm having a good time. So I'm already working on the next book. And I'm a bit superstitious. I don't like to talk about those things too much. It's very different again. Maybe slightly less weird than Beatrix and Fred, to be confirmed. We'll find out. I have the ending, but I'm perfectly open to that changing. But it's quite a bit different. And unusually for me, there's a few more people in it. Like I usually have the two main protagonists, whereas this has a slightly larger cast of important people. So I'm finding that really interesting. Thanks, Katie. I had a lovely time.